Eh bien, welcome back. Bienvenue à nouveau. Today what we are going to do is to start discussing migration. Our chapter in the book is called From the Mouth of the Shark on migration, and you will see why in a minute. That refers to a beautiful poem that I'm going to put up a little bit further. Migration is another of this topic that is at the core of all political discussions in rich countries and in poor countries. Going back to Brexit, one of the heart of the Brexit vote was to prevent migration, both from the other European countries and also from anybody that the Schengen area would let in. In the US, in France, during the last presidential election, a lot of the campaign by Marine Le Pen was, as usual, for the campaign for our party, focused on migration. And a lot of this discussion on migration was extreme or was not entirely accurate. For example, saying 99% of migrants are adult men was one of the things that she was saying, which is not true, it turns out. Of course, Donald Trump rode this golden elevator preparing for the 2016 election on the strength of migration, and as he arrived, had put immigration at the core, talking about building the wall, talking about the shithole countries, and so on and so forth. It's during the Trump administration that we had panic at the border, children in cages, that were dominating the news. And even today, in the new administration, you're seeing again migration coming back to the fore, with a lot of South American migrants coming to the border and not being able to enter, and a lot of debate on how many should be able to enter, and so on and so forth. This is not just an American phenomenon. This is there in Europe. Hungary, Slovakia, Italy have immigration as the core of their political discussion. This is not just a rich country phenomenon. In Bangladesh, the Rohingya phenomenon. In India, we have Assamese. In South Africans don't want the Zimbabwean to come, and so on and so forth. It's also not something that is new. It is not the deep distrust for migrants. It's something that has been with us, maybe for as long as they had been migrants. In 1893 in France, there was a massacre of Italian migrants, somewhere between 20 and 150, we don't even know exactly the number, of Italian migrants who were working in salt marshes in France, in Egmont, were attacked and killed by French workers. And what were French workers objecting to? The two objections that today are again at the core. One is that they are stealing our work, and the second is that they are criminals. It's exactly the same discussion that are always at the core of the discussion. On the one hand, we are competing for a limited amount of work, and they will all come to steal our work. And on the other hand, they are not like us, they have a different culture, they cannot assimilate, etc. And what is really striking is that it goes from wave to wave. So after the Italian migrants finally adjusted to the French society and were accepted, the French became very suspicious of the Poles, and then once the Poles had adjusted, they became very suspicious of the Spaniards and the Portuguese, and when the Spaniards and Portuguese had adjusted, then we became very suspicious of people coming from North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's kind of always comes back. It seems to be a very permanent struggle in political society, and it's useful to put it a little bit in historical perspective to remember that we're not uniquely anti-immigrants in today's society. But let's start with where we are today. So the starting point of the anti-migration sentiment is that that's just uncontrollable. That you can, some migration is okay. After all, the fruits have to be picked in the summer, and some people have to do this work. But there is really just too much. And if the borders were open, then there really would be a complete flood of migrants. And we're seeing, images of boats that are full of migrants back to the brim, and we are seeing caravans of people walking together from Central America, and we have this idea that we are just about to be overwhelmed by migrants. And the thing is, nothing could be further from the truth, just quantitatively. So if there is one thing you need to remember from this lecture, is this number. In normal years, migration flow represents just 3% of the world's population. In 2019, before the COVID crisis, 2.7 million non-EU nationals immigrated to the EU. That's it. The EU is a big place. If you look at the graph here, you're seeing the permanent migration flow to the OECD country, and it's fairly stable, and it's not that large. There was an expansion of refugee flows around the Syrian crisis in 2016, 2017. It was back to normal by 2018. And of course, 2019 here is just a prediction. That's it. There is no flood. There is no vast movement of migration. And in fact, of course, now there is the opposite of a flood because there is a complete crash of migration following the COVID-19 crisis. There was the complete plummet of new resident permit in 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. So not only in normal year we don't have a flood, but now whatever it is was immediately stopped. But that's of course a very special year, and it's going to start again. Maybe there'll be a blip of a catch-up for people who would have wanted to migrate in 2019 who are going to come now. But by and large, migration is just not this vast hordes of people who are waiting to come from poor countries to rich countries. Of course, that's not at all what people have in mind. So this is data from a paper by Alesina, Stancheva, and Miano looking at the immigration perception and reality. And what you see is that, for example, in the US, where the actual share of migrants in the economy is about 10%, people think that it's almost 40%. So there is a huge gap between perception and reality, but it's not just a US phenomenon. We're seeing exactly the same thing in all of the countries they survey, which are all rich countries, where people are just completely over-exaggerating the fraction of migrants in the country. At the same time as they think there are very many migrants in the country, they also tend to think that migrants are more likely to be Muslims than they are in reality, that they are more likely to be uneducated than they are in reality, that they are more likely to be unemployed than they are in reality. So people not only misperceive the number of migrants that there are in the countries, but they also misperceive their characteristics, and I think that these floods of people who are about to invade us is also a flood of, uneducated work thieves and criminals, as the French people thought in the 19th century. So why this gap? Why is there such a strong gap between perception and reality? The one possible explanation is that everyone has in the back of their mind this very simple graph, which is what you would have been taught if instead of taking this class, you would have taken a more classical intro econ class, Economics 101, which is there is a relationship between wage and employment. So if you have a lot of people who are looking for work, then employer can lower the wage because, oh well, there are a lot of people who are looking for work, so you're going to always find someone to do your work even if you lower the wage. So the more people who want to work, the lower the wage. That's the labor demand curve. Conversely, of course, if the wage is higher, more people want to work. So that's the labor supply curve, which goes in the other direction. And at the point where these two curves meet, is going to determine how many people are employed and how many people and what wage they make. If the wage is any higher, more people will want to work, therefore the wage will go down. If the wage is any lower, fewer people will want to work, therefore there will be fewer workers and the wage will go up. So in normal time, we have this equilibrium between the wages that are being offered and the number of people who want to work. Now, what happens when you have migrants coming into the country? Well, that's more people. So basically, it's the equivalent as if all of us suddenly wanted to work more. So more people come into the economy. The labor supply shifts to the right. More people want work. There is not an infinite supply of work. So people see, the employers see all of these people willing to work. They can afford to lower the wages. And as a result, the wages go down. So an even simpler version of thinking of that, which is perhaps in the back of the mind of many people, is to think of the amount of work there is as a big pie. And if we are not too many people sharing this pie, we each have a big share of it. But suddenly all the migrants come and they all want to share the same pie, so we each get a smaller slice. So that's the equivalent of that, which is if there are many, many migrants, they are all, going, waiting, queuing for jobs, willing to work maybe for even lower job, so for lower wages. So that's putting downward pressure on wages and hurting the native. So that's the model that people have in mind. What we write in our book is the logic is simple, seductive, and wrong. It's just wrong at many levels. So the first part of the argument is this idea that the migrants are going to move the supply curve to the right. It has to be true in this simple model because the wages are so much higher in our country that obviously people want to work in our country and not in theirs. We have it so much better in our country that everyone, if they had a choice, if there was not a barrier, they would want to come here. So let's discuss that part of it. And here is where the poem comes from. The subtitle of the poem, the subtitle of our chapter came from this poem, from a Somali poet called Worcestershire. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors run faster than you, breath bloody in their throat. The boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. And what she expressed is what is often the driver behind migration. It's not for most people, oh, I could make more money by moving elsewhere. It is, there is a war in my country, something is pushing me out. Otherwise, I would rather stay home. So this is a poem, so this is not evidence, although that expresses the feeling that a lot of people have. But let's look at some data that suggests that this poem does capture something in reality. So the first point is migrants do not come from the poorest country at all. So let's look first at the absolute number. Where are the migrants coming from? They are coming from India, which is not a poor country. They are coming from Mexico. They are coming from Russia. They are coming from China. They are coming from Bangladesh, Syria. And we don't see in here any of the really, really poor countries in the world. They are just not sending very many migrants. Now you might say, well, of course, but they're also coming from the big countries. That's why you're seeing them coming from those countries. That's relevant because this is telling us where the migrants are from. So they are not the poorest people, the migrants who are actually making it. They are people who are coming from middle-income economy, the BRIC countries being fairly well-educated, well-fed, etc. But let's look at this other thing, whether from poor countries people are much more likely to immigrate. And so this is now the percentage of sending country population in 2015. Many, many migrants are coming from Bosnia, or were coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina at the time. Cape Verde, that's a poor country, poor but small. Then we have Albania, Portugal, that's not a poor country, Georgia, Bulgaria, Poland, Mexico again, Morocco, UK. So what we're seeing here is a hodgepodge of countries, but mostly not characterized by the fact that they are particularly poor. The only really poor country in this list is Mali, which is really quite far down the list, and is below UK in terms of the number of migrant descent. So the migrants don't come from the poorest countries, even in fraction of the population. They come from a hodgepodge of places, some which are just simply kind of mobile and rich, like the UK. Some where there is either a lot of crime, like Mexico, or which are in the throes of a war, like Syria. This is not primarily poverty that seems to be pushing a lot of the migrants that are traveling around the world. That's not to say that it is not sometimes poverty. You're seeing some people coming from Mali or from other sub-Saharan African countries, but quantitatively, in terms of the number of migrants we are seeing, this is actually quite low. Another way to look at this is, instead of just looking at the average number of migrants that are coming from each country, is looking in more detail at case studies evidence from some countries. And there is a study by Mahesh Shrestha from the World Bank on Nepal, which is, Nepal is a big migration country. People in Nepal are both migrating to India and also migrating to to many countries in the Gulf, like Qatar or the UAE, in relatively large numbers. And what Mahesh Shrestha looked at is what pushes people to move. Is it a particular bad year, for example, a particular bad monsoon year? Or are they more likely to move when there is violence where they come from? And you can see here in this graph just the image that is going to give you the first part of the answer, which is the intensification of the civil conflict in Nepal. That's actually Maoist conflict, Maoist guerrilla, believe it or not, very active in some parts of Nepal. You're seeing the intensification of that over time. So when it becomes redder is when there is more conflict. And then you're seeing in the next picture, the one that has green and blue, you're seeing the migration both to India and to the Gulf states from various regions in Nepal. And you can see over time, the places becoming more blue are the places that are sending more migrants. And that seems to be quite related to where the Maoist conflict is flaring up. So this is simply a very graphical illustration, but what it does is to do that more systematically, statistically, and also compare it to what happens when there is a good monsoon or a bad monsoon. So what he finds, interestingly, is the monsoon, if anything, goes in the opposite direction to what you might have expected, which is when the monsoon is good, more people are moving. When there is good weather and good harvest, more people are moving than when the monsoon fails and people's harvests are failing. So it goes in the opposite direction. It's not the poverty that is pushing them, it's that they need enough money to even organize the migration. What really pushes them is a flare-up in the Maoist country, that in the Maoist conflict, that does, you see it in the graph, but it's also true in the regression, encourages the migration both towards India and towards the Gulf states. So that's like just an example, one case study that highlights the point that I was making before, which is people are typically when there are large migration flux, these are people fleeing conflict or violence. That's true in Central America, just as it is true in Syria, just as it is true in Nepal, as opposed to people escaping poverty. So how come people are not moving due to poverty? How come the lure of high wages, much, much, much higher wages that people would get if they managed to migrate from Niger to Paris, doesn't encourage like everyone, even more people, to go on boats and try to go. And in particular, even in a sense more puzzling is why, even when there are no barrier, for example, people migrating within countries, people are not deciding to move even within countries. So one possibility is that, in fact, migration does not increase wages that much. What we know is that someone who is originally from Niger, the people who are originally from Niger in Paris, make much more money than people who are from Niger in Niger. We know that, that's evident. But maybe it's because the people who manage to make it to Paris are so enterprising and so special they would also have made a lot of money in Niger. So maybe we are exaggerating the difference in wages for a particular person if they decide to migrate. Or maybe the wages are larger, but people don't know in general, and if only they did, they would migrate in larger number. So let's investigate both possibilities. So the first one is this question of, is migration really beneficial? So at first you might think this is totally obvious, because a Mexican makes more money in Texas than in Mexico. So this is definitely a good thing to migrate from a money point of view. But in fact, migrants might be selected such that it's the most motivated, the most enterprising, the most connected who manage to travel, and those would have made more money also in Mexico. So how can we solve this problem? How can we find out how much more money a particular person would make if they migrate? Trying to remove this difference that comes from the fact that migrants are inherently different. A first way is to use visa lotteries. So many countries have, in order to limit migration, have lotteries, formal lotteries, in which you have to enter if you want to migrate. For example, you can enter a lottery to get a green card and go to the US as a permanent migrant. New Zealand has this program with Tonga, where Tonga, which is a small, very poor island off the coast of New Zealand, can enter into a lottery every year and hope that way to get a visa to migrate to New Zealand. So researchers at the World Bank conducted a survey of people who had applied to this lottery, and they compared the winners and the losers. And of course, the losers and the winners are comparable because it was a fair lottery. Once they look at the winners, the ones who have managed to go to New Zealand, they are much richer. They triple their income within 1 year after leaving Tonga. So it is pretty clear that for people who are absolutely comparable, winning the migration lottery makes you much richer. At the other end of the spectrum in terms of income, there is a study by Michael Clements who looks at the lottery for H-1B visas. So H-1B visas are the professional visas given to people like software engineers, faculty members, etc., who want to come around the world. So there is a lottery for getting your H-1B visa to work in India, or for Indian software professional to come to the US. And what he finds is people who won the H-1B lottery, software engineers who won the H-1B lottery, earn 6 times as much in the US than the comparable people who lost the lottery. So that suggests that the differences in wages that we do observe among migrants and non-migrants are causal. They are really due to the migration, not due to systematic differences among them. Now, there is a wrinkle to that, which is this is among people who have applied. So this is still a small minority of people. Most Tonganese do not enter the lottery, they don't wish to move. Most Indians are not in a position to apply to the H-1B lottery. So although it is the causal effect of migration that we are measuring with lotteries, It is the causal effect of migration for people for whom it is beneficial. So maybe it's a very, very small minority. And maybe the truth is most people would not be capable to really make it in the other countries. That's why they decide to stay home. And maybe that's the result of all of these barriers that we are putting to make it difficult to migrate. And therefore, we should leave it that way. Should I stop? That would be a good time to stop for question. If there.
We have another question on Zoom. Navia, please go ahead.
I just wanted to know that most often we see that conflict is also related to poverty. So how can we conclusively state that migration is just higher because of conflict, which again can be related back down to poverty?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do we separate the impact of conflict and poverty, given that conflict is often itself a product of poverty? So how can we separate the two? So there are, of course, conflicts that are at least, so they are related to conflicts is often caused by poverty. We, in fact, have evidence of that, of bad climate, droughts, etc., increasing the prevalence of conflict. But not all poverty episodes lead to a conflict. So what's statistically, for example, what Mahesh does in his work is to put it all in the same place, which is to say, let's look at good and bad monsoon year, and then on top of that, let's look at where the Maoist insurrection was. And you're right that there might be correlation. It might tend to be in the same places, but you need something else in the conflict. You also need, for example, that it's close to where their bases tend to be. There are places where the government reaction was stronger, and so on and so forth. But that's a very good question and there is in fact a long discussion in the paper to think about how do we actually distinguish the two, and is it legitimate to say, well, this is a conflict that is over and above the increase in the poverty. And since in this particular instance, the increase in the poverty tends otherwise to diminish migration, that is also something that helps us in this case to separate the two, which is in the absence, in the non-Maoist stronghold, you see the poverty, when the monsoon is bad, the poverty goes up, the migration goes down, whereas when the conflict goes up, so in the regions where the conflict went up the most over time, this is where you see increases in migration. But that's a great question. That's it's a little you need to be careful to distinguish the two.
Some people asked about how does this departure of migrants affect the economy that they're from, and you mentioned that the migrants tend to be educated, so how significant is this brain drain, and is there any solution for it? And the second question is, can you say a bit more about the cumulative effects of sustained levels of migration from non-OECD to OECD countries in terms of ethnic diversity change and changes in societal norms?
So the excellent question on the brain drain. So we are not going to be talking much about it in the classes, so let me say a few words. So there is definitely a worry about the brain drain, in particular, that given the fact that the migration, again, is often, in particular, in response to conflict or to political strife, the migration is actually a very educated migration. And then you find yourself bereft of the people who would have been maybe the best placed to encourage or to nurture the economy once, for example, once the conditions are more favorable. On the other hand, migration also produces reverse migration. And again, remember, the numbers are never that high. So you still always have doctors and nurses in the countries and people who are running businesses in the countries. But then once you have a lot of migrants coming from a country, two things happen. First of all, you get remittances. In some countries, like El Salvador, for example, that's basically what makes the entire economy ticking. And second thing, you have people forging links and forging relationship in the country they went to. So for example, in India, a lot of the software workers who have spent some time in the US then go back and established, in a sense, the whole software industry. And so there is a brain gain coming from the fact that these migrants do go away, and then when they come back, bring with them both expertise and relationships. There is a nice paper by Hillel Rapoport looking at a migration from the Bosnia-Herzegovina. We saw that was a big migration center to Germany and then back, and showing that when the people went back, they actually established businesses in the places where, in the sectors where they had been working while they were away. So people were sent a little bit randomly to various places in Germany. They picked up some trade and some expertise, and then when they came back, they kind of developed those industries where they came from. So I don't think there is a final word on whether the brain gain is a brain gain or a brain drain at the end of the day, but it's a very interesting line of inquiry.
And then there was the question about the ethnic diversity, the change.
Yes. So again, that's a good point. Again, remember, it's not that many people. So even sustained over time, it's still not that many people. And also, there is this permanent worry that the next generation of migrants is not going to adjust, but the previous wave did adjust. So in a few lectures, we are going to discuss precisely that, which is to what extent the anti-migration phenomenon is more about the perception that they are socially different and very difficult to integrate, and the extent to which this perception is valid or not valid. So we just saw that people who applied for lotteries, when they do come back, if they do win the lottery, they make much more money, 3 to 6 times in the 2 studies that I noted, than if they had not moved. But they are selected because it's a small minority of people who choose to participate in the lottery. So are there examples where we can look at people's migration when they did not volunteer to migrate? Of course, they are the conflicts, but the conflicts have themselves a lot of other implications, and as they also are related to poverty, as we discussed before. So are there situations we can look at where the migration was forced by something that was, or induced by something that was itself not so disruptive that we can then look and follow what happens to the people? And there is a very nice example of internal migration taking place in Iceland. So in 1973, there was a huge explosion in the Westman Island of a volcano. And there's work by Nakamura, Steinson, and Sigmundson looking at what happens to the people who were in the Westman Island then. So when the volcano erupted, some houses got destroyed. Some got destroyed by lava bombs, which is why this slide is called lava bomb. And those who lost their house, so if you got a lava bomb on your house, you lost your house, you got given money, and then you could do whatever you wanted with the money. 42% of people who lost their house and therefore got money decided to leave the island. And only 27% of those who had not lost their house decided to leave the island as well. Then the nice thing about Iceland is people are followed very carefully, and in fact also across generations. So what they do in the paper is to look at the descendants of people who, by this accident of luck, got forced to move with their parents. And they're finding that after having moved, they were making $3,000 more per year than if they stayed. And it's just the ones who have lost their house. So, you can see not all of them have moved. So it's on average people who have lost their house were making $3,000 more. Why is that? Mainly because they were more likely to have gone to college and to choose a different profession and to be fishermen. So most people in this island are fishermen. And basically what happens is if you're not forced to move, you just stay a fisherman and you earn your living as a fisherman and life is pretty good. But if there is an event like that that pushes you out, you didn't apply for it, you didn't select for it, and you're pushed to go for it, you suddenly change, decide to do something else. The kids go to college and they end up making much more money. So that shows that there is in fact a causal effect of migration, even within country migration in this case. And that people are just, so if people decided to move, they would do well. And if the random person decided to move, they would do well. But most of the time, they just don't decide to do it. And we have to assume that they make this decision thinking of it seriously. Let me stop here since it's 12. We can take back exactly from this point tomorrow and conclude the migration section and start with international trade. Thank you very much. So today we are going to spend 1 hour to finish talking about migration. And then for our second hour, Abhijit Banerjee is going to come and start talking about international trade. So what we just saw is that there are huge benefits to migration, in this case internal migration within Iceland, for people who are forced to migrate. And yet, as we saw also before, a lot of people decide that they are not interested in migrating. A lot of people mostly stay home unless there is a strong pressure to migrate. Now, why is that? Is it because, for example, they don't know that all these benefits are there? Is it then that it would be relatively easy to convince them to go if only it was it was something that was actually a common knowledge? So to find this out and also to try out the benefits of migration in another context, researchers run an experiment in Bangladesh. Bangladesh, like many developing countries, is heavily dependent on agriculture in the rural areas. And agriculture is very heavily season dependent. In particular, there is a season that is referred to as the manga season, or the season of hunger, the season of famine. In that season, it's in between the harvest, there is very little to eat, and people live very difficult lives. So what these researchers did is that they provided people who chose to migrate with a small incentive to actually migrate, more or less equivalent to the price of the bus ticket to go to the city. So as they did that, they randomly selected who would get the help and who wouldn't. In some villages, people were offered this program. In some villages, they were just offered information about migrating. And in some villages, they were not offered the program. So the first thing you can do is to compare those who were offered the program and those who were not offered the program, who are strictly comparable in terms of their decision to migrate. And what you can see here in the yellow and blue bars is those who were offered the chance to migrate are more likely to migrate. But it's not that everybody went, even though they got this incentive that paid for the ticket. They got about close to 60% of people who got a chance decided to migrate. I should mention, by the way, this is temporary migration, just during the hungry season, and this is usually very close to a nearby city or even to a nearby rural areas which has a different agricultural cycle and needs people to work. So people were more likely to go. And then because some people were more likely to go, you can trace what happens to them and what happens to their family. And what they find is that those who decided to go, compared to people who didn't go, were able to remit a lot of money to their family in the village. As a result, those families consumed more food, about 30% more on food expenditure, on non-food expenditure and food expenditure. They also got many more calories, so close to 700 extra calories, which represents the difference basically between being near starvation and being quite well fed. So that's a huge benefit to migration to the people who stayed in the village. So you imagine that the migrants themselves also eat and consumes and lives better. So this is something that happened to be a hugely beneficial move. So now here is what's surprising, is that number one, the next year, are these people who got a chance to migrate the first time more likely to migrate again? A little bit. We still see a difference in the next year migration between the yellow and the blue bars. But not that much. The difference becomes small, and 2 years later, it's even smaller. Moreover, they also had a treatment where they informed people of the potential benefit of migration, and nobody reacted to that treatment. They were not more likely to move after hearing the potential benefits of migration. Finally, they did this experiment again on a much larger scale. And in that second experiment, they were simply not able to convince people to go for temporary migration, even with this offer of a bus ticket. So to summarize, we have this paradox where we have these very clearly large gains that people experience if they move, and yet a very strong reluctance to go, even once people know that these benefits exist. So clearly, what prevents people to migrate, even in situations like this internal migration in Bangladesh, where there are absolutely no legal barriers to do so, is not that, in fact, most people would not benefit from the migration. It's not either that they might benefit from the migration, but they don't know. There are other things. So we are going to go back to this point a little bit later in the lecture to try and understand what stands in the way for people to migrate. Why is it the case that it's only very few people who make this choice? But before that, I want to go back to our simple argument that if the barriers to migration were removed, so many people would move. We already saw that that's probably not the case. And then once so many people have moved, they would compete with native workers, in particular with the least privilege of the native workers, and therefore they would take their job or lower their wages. So we already showed that the first part of this argument is not completely correct or not correct at all. Now let's look at the second part of the argument. What happens when there are very big waves of migrants, which happens from time to time? For example, in response to conflict, there was very big waves of Syrian migrants in various countries. So what happens in those cases? Is it the case that the native workers suffer? So the classic paper that gives us a chance to answer this question is a paper by David Card, an economics professor at Berkeley, on the Mariel boat lift. So the Mariel boat lift was an episode in the history of Cuba and the US, where suddenly, for a very short period of time, Fidel Castro allowed anybody who wanted to leave Cuba to leave. And these people, a large number of people, decided to go on boats and landed in Cuba. Very, very large number of people. This happened in matters of days. In particular on April 29, 1980, and the next day. So this was a huge wave of migrants, completely unprecedented for the city of Miami. So this is exactly the type of cases where you might expect that the domestic market would have been completely overrun by migrants, and people would have suffered in terms of their wages. This paper is like the archetypal example of what we call in economics a natural experiment, which is it's something that happens in history, nobody manipulated or made it happen, but it creates a situation that is very stark and that allows us to compare Miami, for example, with other very similar cities, before and after the Mariel boat lift. So what David Card did is that he collected data on real wages in Miami and in similar cities, 4 cities of about the same size, the same demographic makeup around the US. And he collected data on real wages, or used data on real wages of people aged 16 to 61 in Miami and in those 4 cities. So you see Miami on the top panel and the 4 cities on the bottom panel. for years before and after the Marielle boat lift experiment. So you can look, for example, at whites, and you can see that in 1979 and in 1980, the wages were similar in Miami and in the other places. And then you can see whether they become very different in the following year, in 81, in 82, in 83. And the bottom line is that they don't. They just continue to evolve exactly on the same path in Miami and in the other city. In other words, this is the dog that didn't bark. Nothing happened. There is this huge wave of migrants coming to the city of Miami, and people continue to get jobs. And that's true for whites, and that's true for, even true for Hispanics, and it's true also for blacks. So regardless of the group, people continue to get more or less the same wages in Miami and elsewhere. So this paper was a bit of a landmark in the economics literature on migration because first of all, it was one of the first ones to exploit so creatively one of these episodes of nature by comparing the city of Miami to other places, and second of all, for what it did find, or rather what it did not find, which is it was so ingrained in the profession and also, I think, among them, in the minds of many people that those workers would be competing with the domestic workers, that everybody really expected to see that when you have such a large influx of migrants, you would find a drop in the wages. So this led to huge controversies. There was numerous attempts by George Borjas and others to prove that this could not be true. So they were revisiting of the Marielle Boatlift paper and revisiting the revisitors. But by and large, the finding did hold. And even more importantly, the exact same strategy was applied for many, many situations of a similar kind. For example, when a vast number of former Pieds Noirs came back to France from Algeria, one can look at what happens in Marseille and around compared to other cities in France. And again, there was no massive shocks due to that. And there were many other examples of using this like sudden unexpected migration waves, usually due to a conflict or a war, to see what happens to the native workers, always coming to the same conclusion. So a few years ago, the National Academy of Science commissioned a team, including David Card and George Borjas, to look at that literature and come back to sort of a conclusion or a consensus statement of what we have to say. And remarkably, what they said is, when measured over a period of 10 years or more, the impact of immigration on the wages of native-born workers overall is very small. So today, this is something that the profession, the economics profession as a whole, has a consensus on. There are not so many things on which consensus is so clear, and this one really took a long time in the making. So it's an interesting, fact. And particularly interesting fact because, again, it goes against the intuition that most people have. So how can it happen? You remember the napkin economics graph. If there are more people competing for jobs, either there should be more unemployment or there should be lower wages. Is it not the case that the labor demand slopes down the way we expect it slopes down? So this is the mystery on which I want to take a little bit of time now.
Yes, so we still have some questions on migration on the topics that we discussed yesterday. The first one is, so in the book you mentioned that unskilled migrants take up jobs that narratives won't generally take, but does that mean that it might actually be a policy objective in developed countries to keep the migrants unskilled instead of investing in upgrading their skills? And then the second question is about the lottery that you discussed yesterday, and the fact that lottery winners from India earn 6 times more in the US, is it indicative that India may not have the environment to support professionals to the extent to efficiently utilize their capacity? And do you think that India is still struggling to become a developed country in this sense, given that 15% of the skilled population is migrating to other countries?
Thank you. Two great questions. So on the first one, we are going to actually, a lot of what we are going to do just now is exactly answering this question, which is why is it the case that migrants do not appear to compete to native? And whether this is something that stays over time, for example, whether that affects the next generation or not. And that's going to go a long time in answering this particular question. On the second question of why the wages of a similarly skilled professional is so much lower in India than in the US, I think this has a lot to do with the environment, and in particular the presence of other skilled people, which are complement to each other, as well as the presence of capital, so more computer, machines, etc., and a general environment that creates demand, an extra demand for this type of jobs. So that reflects to some extent extra productivity of the worker when he moves or she moves to the US, and this is something that you would expect over time as India grows, would be able to catch up with that. And that's a little bit what we are going to discuss also when we talk about economic growth. So why does the simple logic that the workers, the migrants, do not displace the native workers, do not take their wages, why does it fail? Where does this simple model doesn't manage to explain reality? So there are many reasons for that actually, and they've all been explored in the literature. The first one is simply that migrants are not just workers. Migrants are also consumers. And when they arrive in a place, they need food, they need lodging, and they need many things that mostly other non-skilled people produce for them. In particular, for everything that is very locally traded, like haircuts and restaurants and things like that. So when the migrant comes, two things happen. Number one, of course, they start and get jobs. So the labor supply, so there is a shift of the labor supply. But number two, they also demand more things, so there is a shift of the labor demand as well. And so what we see is that both things change. There is more demand for the services of the local workers, and there is also more supply. And the two kind of could already balance out to a large extent. In fact, when you see a situation where migrant workers are allowed just to work but have to come back home, for example, in a border situation, where people come from a country and work to another country but go back home, this is where you could start seeing in those situations, you're more likely to see a fall of wages in the border workers. Because the migrants come and they work, but then they come back home and therefore they don't consume. And that's the first reason. A second reason is that migrants are used in many situations by employers to replace native workers that they find difficult to deal with. So native workers are more confident about their rights. They are more demanding of good working conditions and salaries. And therefore, for employers, migrants can be a very good substitute because migrants are desperate to do something. And they don't have the social networks that allow them to wait out until something better comes up. As a result, what happens when migrants are not allowed to come or when they are pushed out? It's not necessarily that migrants are replaced by native workers and therefore the wage of the native worker is pushed up, but sometimes they are just replaced by machines. And there was a very stark example of that in 1965, when a large number of what's called the braceros workers were sent back home. So what were the braceros? They were agricultural workers, Mexican mostly, coming to California to help with the harvests on the seasonal basis. There were a large number of those braceros, and there was a big discussion, a big debate in the US at the time that the braceros are actually displacing the native Californians and we need to stop giving them visa to come. So finally, President Kennedy agreed to that and the braceros program was eliminated. So what you see here on the left in the figure 1, you can see that over time you had a lot of braceros in California, no braceros in the rest of the countries, and then suddenly, poof, no braceros anywhere. So if we had expected, if the braceros had in fact been displacing native workers, the native workers would have been hired, and we should have seen an increase in wages in California, which employed a lot of braceros in dark blue, relative to the rest of the country. And in fact, what you see in figure 2, that none of that happened. The wages stayed more or less the same in California than in the rest of the countries before and after the braceros expulsion. So there was zero impact on the wage of native. And so this is, in a sense, the symmetric experiment to the Cuba experiment, is now you remove migrants, and it is not that you get higher wages or better working conditions for the native. So what happens in this case? Well, what happened in this case is that the farmers decided to mechanize agriculture. So what you have after the 1965 braceros expulsion in California is a switch to producers that are amenable to automation, in particular tomatoes, for example. And you have much more equipment, investment in machine harvesting instead of people harvesting. Now that's one example, but there are several in the literature where we see the migrants, in fact, not replacing the workers, but not replacing native workers, but replacing the machines. And what happens when you don't have migrants, you have machines instead. Another reason why migrants might not displace local workers is that they can be, in fact, complementary to the local labor. So in order to produce something, to make cars or something, you need workers of all types. You need workers that are going to paint the car. You need workers that are able to operate the machines that make the car. You need someone who is able to operate the robots that operates the machine that makes the car. So workers are working together, sometimes as substitute, because if I take an unskilled worker who screws bolts, and I can replace him by someone who does exactly the same job, but often as complement, in the sense that to produce a finished product, you need a bit of everybody. And what happens with native workers is that, with migrants, is that sometimes they produce, if in some industries you can have a situation where you have a vast number of people coming, they make a part of the widget, and the rest of the workers therefore can start working with them to produce the widgets. So what happens when you have migrants is that sometimes instead of pushing the native worker out of the labor market or pushing them down, they push them up, because basically they create more positions of management that are available to the local workers. So there is a very nice illustration of that in Denmark. So this is a paper that looks at the near random placement of migrants in Denmark. So between 1991 and 2008, the migrants in Denmark were first placed more or less randomly across Denmark, depending where there was availability to house them. And then when there was a huge explosion in migration, the new ones came to the places where they had people of the same ethnic group. So some cities which happened to have 2 or 3 people from Yugoslavia suddenly found a huge influx of Yugoslavian migrants coming to them. Some city which had, at the beginning, received people from Iraq, if fewer people from Iraq came, didn't get a big influx of migrants. As a result, that produces almost, again, another natural experiment, where some places in Denmark got a lot of new migrants and some didn't. And what this paper did is to compare the occupation, the wages, and the type of position in the hierarchy of the native worker in places that have more migrants. And what they find is that, if you see in the panel 1, is that in places that got more migrants over time, the younger cohort got more and more complex tasks in their day-to-day jobs. So what you can do is to find out what are people doing for a living, are they doing, and then you can codify these tasks to give you a sense of the complexity of someone's job. And what you find is that the more migrants there are in a place, the more the natives do more complex tasks. Basically because the simple tasks are taken over by the natives, so by the migrants, so the natives are needed to do the complex tasks that are around the management of those simpler tasks. Similarly, conversely, you're seeing less manual intensity of work of the native worker. And as a result, in these cases in Denmark, actually an increase in the hourly wage for the native worker due to the increase to the influx of migrants. Another thing that leads to that makes this basic logic fail is that it is not true that migrants are just unskilled labor that are going to replace the other unskilled labor. They are often, particularly because they are so strongly selected, people who are gritty, who are enterprising, who really want to succeed in life. And therefore, when you have more migrants, a lot of migrants coming, you have a lot of these potential entrepreneurs. So we have already mentioned the BioNTech couple, but you can think of Jeff Bezos' adopted family, Elon Musk. All of these people are people who at some point had a contact with migration. So you might say, well, fine, you can always cite 5 examples. We can also find 5 examples of very enterprising natives. So we are not learning much from that. And then there is the question of whether, precisely because the migrants will replace the native on the least skilled task, as a result, they would be kind of stuck in those type of tasks and not able to progress themselves. So is it that this example of the very entrepreneurial migrants is just kind of a fluke that we should not pay much attention to? And there, to answer these questions, we can look at the intergenerational mobility of migrants compared to non-migrants. So what is that? Well, you are simply comparing the wage or the position in society of children compared to where their parents were. So you have that here for 4 periods. Historically, the 80 to 1910 cohort, 1910 to 1940, and then 84 to 2006, and finally today. And what you can see here is 2 slopes, and each of these slopes is the position of the son against the position of the parents. And what you can see is that it is steeper for the local than for the migrants. In other words, the migrants start low, but their children overtake their parents faster than the native do. The native in the US, unfortunately, the mobility has tended to go down, so the natives stay lower and stay wherever they were. The migrants are more are above, the children of the migrants grow faster in terms of their income than the children of the natives. And that was true historically, and that is still true today. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. That tells you that this idea of migrants being particularly gritty and enterprising is not an exception. It is kind of general, that there is actually faster intergenerational mobility going on, of course, with an integration in the labor market, in the educational market, etc., among migrants than non-migrants.
So there is a question on some of the phenomena that you have discussed. How they would look like for illegal immigrants? And then there is a question on conflict. If you could comment if migration leads to conflict in countries or areas where people migrate, how does this change things? And then there is a more general question on the extent of capitalist exploitation of less developed countries by developed countries. How much is this responsible for the migration patterns that we see today?
So, for the conflict question is one that we are going to go back, because here today we are talking mostly about the impact of migration on economic outcomes. But when we discuss about preference, racism, discrimination, etc., we'll go back to migration as potentially generating conflicts due to differences in values or perception of values, etc. So we'll go back specifically to this. On the last question on the exploitation of the poor countries, well, again, what we see is that there is not so much migration in the first place. So in a sense, it could be that the exploitation of the rich country by the rich country of the poor country caused little migration, but there are other things that certainly are at play as well. And remind me the first question.
How the phenomena look like for illegal immigrants?
Yes, the comparison between legal and illegal immigrants. So to be honest, I don't know the details of that. The impact of the natives, that's, I think, not. It's the entire set of migrants that we are looking at, legal or illegal. So for the impact of native, I think that's taken into account. For a lot of the difficulties that I'm going to talk about in a minute in terms of why it's difficult to migrate, when I talk about the barriers to migration, anything that I'm going to say for the legal migrant is going to be even stronger for the illegal migrants. And in a sense, what I'm going to talk about just now is going to locate it, also be make that transition between the difference between legal and illegal migrants. So the next reason why this simple logic doesn't work, why migrants are not pushing the natives out, is that they are not just competing with natives. The labor market is not like a market for potatoes or lemons. The labor is not an ordinary commodity, notwithstanding what Karl Marx was saying. Much of a worker's quality is very hard to assess. How do you know if the person is going to show up on time? How do you know if they are going to be work well with their teammates, etc.? So the employers want to know their worker, want to know something about their workers. And that means that anybody who is already there to start with has a huge advantage, because they're already known that they are working out okay. So someone who just shows up at the gate of the factory and say, I would like to work, cannot displace whoever is already there by offering to work for a lower wage. So the second thing is that if you now need additional workers, for skilled workers, you can show your credentials. So you have been to that school and I have that diploma, etc. Number one, that's going to reassure about your quality. Number two, it's a sign that you did well in the rest of your career. So you must be somewhat dependable. For unskilled worker, that's usually not available. So if someone doesn't have experience, then they need reference, either reference from a former employment or reference from workers. So what are the consequences of that? The first one is that incumbents are safe in their job. There really is a huge wedge between the salary of the incumbents and what someone new can offer in order to replace them in their job, because it is so good to get the person you already have in place that you prefer to do that. The second one is that the employer is not going to want to lower the wage so much that the worker is indifferent between keeping their job and just quitting. Because since one way in which you're going to motivate the worker to continue working, since you cannot be always in their position, is by giving them just a little bit of an advantage to stay in the job, in order for them to not be tempted to quit. Because it is so much better to keep the people you already have that you want to make it worthwhile for them. The third consequence is that because of that, immigrants cannot just come and say, I'll work for less. because I'll work for less even than the people you have in your firm. I'm willing to take a pay cut, and I'm willing to pay less than the workers you already have. Why is that? Well, because then that would lead to inequality of salaries between the different wage workers in the companies. And there is evidence that shows that people hate it. People do not like that people who do similar work are paid so differently. So for all of these reasons, immigrants are unable really to put a downward pressure on wages, and therefore the people who already have a job are reasonably safe in their jobs. And also, it is harder for them to have access to a referral network for a job. So, by the way, this means that we might have a little bit of our preference for migration backwards. In general, although people are anti-migration in general, they tend to support skilled migration. For example, in the UK, where the attitude to migrations are generally quite negative, they are actually quite favorable to skilled migration. Here is one question that was asked by YouGov about doctors and nurses in the NHS, which basically is asking whether they would support the employment of doctors and nurses and remove immigration cap as long as people worked in the National Health Service. And you can see that 36% of people strongly support removing the caps or tend to support removing the caps. So even people who are quite skeptical about migration in general are very favorable to skilled migration. But interestingly, it's actually easier for the skilled migrant to replace the local workers because they come with credentials. And in fact, there is a study on nurses, since this poll was about nurses, showing that for every foreign-born nurse in a city, there is exactly one fewer native nurse. So for nurses, which is precisely what the Britons want to come to Britain, there is exactly a 1-for-1 crowding out of the local nurses with the foreign nurses. And part of that is that pushes the downward pressure on the wages because the nurses can offer to work for less. And the working condition becomes harder because the foreign nurses are willing to accept these conditions despite their credentials. And therefore, it becomes less attractive for local people to even take the exam to become a nurse. So maybe if there is any questions on this phenomenon, I can stop here. Otherwise, I can continue. So why are people not moving? So again, it is worth reminding that in normal times, even within free mobility zones, such as the EU, for example, or within states, migration is very low. At the height of the Greek financial crisis, less than 3% of the population left Greece, despite the fact that the unemployment was 27%. So people who were in Greece could have gone anywhere in Europe, just stayed in Greece. So that's one example. Another example is on this graph on the right side of the screen, where you see that the state-to-state migration, which is completely free, is quite low. Was quite low in 2001, both in India, in Brazil, in China, and in the US. So people are not moving, even when there are no barriers for people to move. So why is it the case? So there are no legal barriers, but there still are barriers. The first one is this question of referrals that we were just talking before, which is when you want a job, particularly if you are an unskilled worker without credentials, when you want a job, you need to rely on social networks. And in fact, we see that people, migrants, do rely on the social networks to be hired. For example, there is a very interesting paper by Kaivan Munshi looking at the US. And they're looking at Mexican migrants going to various cities. So they look at, so what happens is that there might be very bad conditions in Mexico that somehow leads to an exodus of people from a particular village. For example, a very severe drought or a conflict. And then those people settle somewhere in the US. Later on, the people who are from the same village in Mexico are more likely to migrate to this town And once they get to this town, they get better jobs and higher wages than people who come from other villages. And what is happening is that first wave of migrants creates a kind of a nexus of people, a first kernel of people from a particular village, and therefore a social network for the people from that village that allows them and enables to succeed in that labor market. Similarly, in the US, the IRC, which is the Refugee Resettlement Agency, randomly allocates people to cities. And if they end up in places where they have a lot of people from their own country, even people they've never met before, they are more likely to succeed in the labor market because they rely on that social network and that help. But the problem is, what happens if you don't have access to such a network? The vast majority of people do not have other refugees that have happened to migrate precisely in that city. Most Mexicans do not have people from their village that have gone to a particular place. In that case, you might find yourself, if you're the one person without a network, in a terrible situation because the market could unravel. Akerlof talks about the market for lemons, and the idea is that if you expect everyone to have either referrals or a referral from a former employer or from the social network, and someone shows up without that referral, then there must be something deeply wrong with them. And therefore, you're not going to even go there or consider this person, even though they might have been perfectly well. And if we didn't live in a world where referral was everywhere, you would have looked at them. So basically, the very fact that there are some people who are relying on a social network means that it makes it very difficult for anybody else who don't have a social network. And by the way, what this means is that people who are less connected to start with, women, minorities, and of course migrants, find themselves in more and more fragile positions. And so that's one reason why migrants might decide not to go or even not to move internally, because if they don't have the social network to make it happen at the destination places, they might not succeed. The second reason is that migrating often means that you're going to put yourself in a situation that is going to be a very difficult situation. So in particular in developing countries, when we're talking about migrating to large cities, you migrate to a place where, like Delhi, for example, in India, where there is a cap in how high the buildings can be. And therefore, the city is extraordinarily spread out. So you can end up living extremely far, and then you end up living in conditions that are absolutely terrible, in slums or semi-slums. And you find those slums and semi-slums in all of the big cities in developing countries, partly because the infrastructure is not developed enough and the constructions is not dense enough for people to live together in decent conditions. The developing country cities are also extremely polluted. So 23 of the top 20 most polluted cities are, most of the top 20 most polluted cities are in India. The air is polluted, the water is polluted, the infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure is insufficient, etc. So for all of these reasons, when Abhijit and his colleague interviewed some migrants in slums in Delhi, and they like Delhi, they like the fact that there is work, they like the fact that there are good schools for the children, etc., but they hate the living condition. They hate the living environment. And so leaving your countryside to find yourself in this situation is not something that is very desirable. Even in rich countries, there is also a severe lack of housing in places where wages are high. So for example, in San Francisco, there are so strong restrictions of what you can build that people say there are more dogs than children in San Francisco. So you get very nice city for the incumbent, but it makes it very difficult for anybody else to kind of fit in. And hence that limits the mobility, even when it would be in principle possible. A third reason is that in the same way that the social network at destination is really necessary to succeed, to help you find a housing, to help you find a job, to support you if you have a problem, social networks now at the origin destination can really put a weight on you, can really weigh you down and prevent you from moving. Why? It's because when you migrate, not only do you lose your nice little house in the field to end up in a tenement in a foreign city, but you also lose your social network. And the social network is not just to have friends to go to the cafe with, but it's also the source of insurance if you get sick. It's also the source of help with childcare and with daily life. And then finally, it is usually a nexus of joint protection. So you could, for example, have a farm that your parents have, and you have 3 brothers, and if you stay, you can share from the 3 brothers. But if you go, they are going to consider that you're cut off from that social network. You lose your claim to the family farm, and therefore you might make some money in the city, but you lose at the same time the money you would have made on the farm with your brothers. So for all of these reasons, the social network tends to keep people grounded in the village, because that's where you feel more comfortable. And the only people who would be willing to leave are either people who are so rich that they don't need a social network for insurance, or people who are so poor that they are totally desperate and don't even have a social network of insurance in the village. And the people in the middle are the people who are going to stay. In fact, you might have families that, in order to keep their investment going in the social network at home, might not let their children migrate and might purposefully not make the investment that would make them to migrate. So there is a study in India that looks at call centers where people go to work to answer your problem. If you have a problem with your computer, you usually call, and someone in India is going to answer the phone. So these call centers have really developed near Delhi. And there was an experiment where in villages in the states neighboring Delhi, in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh, the companies sent recruiters to advertise that these jobs exist. And in other villages, they didn't do that. And then the researchers looked at what people did in response to that. And what is very interesting is for girls, what they did in response to that, and they sent girls to school to allow them to make them eligible for this kind of job. But for boys, there was a big difference between the first boy, that instead they kept home, and in fact first boys were less likely to be sent to school in those villages because the parents got scared that it would get them the temptation to go to the city to get that job if they had an education. So instead of investing in the boys to send them to get those jobs, the first boys were kept at home in order for them to not migrate. So the migration, the social network at home can be so important in people's lives that they are not only willing to not migrate, but willing to not take the steps that would make migration easier. Also, we should not forget that migration is scary. We discussed migration from Nepal. Some migrants from Nepal go to India. Many go to the Gulf. And although many people from Nepal go to the Gulf, it is something that still terrifies them. Because the Gulf is dangerous. Some people come back from the Gulf states in a coffin. And in fact, the probability that you might die is actually overestimated. So Mahesh Shastra, the same person who did the study about the push and pull factor to migration in Nepal, also ran a study among potential candidates to migration. And he showed them, he ran an experiment where he showed them information cards where he informed them either about the wages or about the risk of death once you get there, or about both. And what he found is that, which you can see in the graph to the right, is that the people who were informed about the risk of death and got the true information about the risk of death lowered their estimates of how likely it is to die. So basically, before getting the information, even the candidate to migration were really overestimating their chance to die abroad. So if you think, first of all, if you do something that is dangerous, and in addition you overestimate the actual danger, then of course that doesn't make you extremely likely to want to undertake that journey. And in fact, he found that when people were given that information, that the death is actually lower than what they thought, they were more likely to live and more likely to actually carry out the migration project that they had started. So that's one of the reasons why this is, of course, an extreme one. But there is always in migration the fear that something bad might happen to you. In fact, during the coronavirus crisis, we definitely had confirmation that something bad can happen to migrants once they move. This is a picture of Indian migrants at the beginning of the first wave of the coronavirus crisis, where a lockdown was promulgated with very few hours for them to get organized. At the same time, they lost their job, they lost a place where they lived, and all of their claims for help in this difficult situation was back at their village. So they had to move in a catastrophic, and this is something that was terrible. So something like that reinforces, of course, the belief that was already there before, is that not only it's dangerous, but you don't even know how dangerous it is, because you don't even know what might happen to you when you get there. So this idea that not only it's dangerous, but you don't even know how dangerous it is, leads us to the distinction between uncertainty and risk. So this is a distinction that Frank Knight made. So with risk, it's something that, okay, there is some risk, but you know the risk. It's a chance of, 5% chance that you might, have an accident, 95% chance that you're going to be fine. 50% chance that you find a job in the first week, 50% chance that you don't. Let's say you know it's risky, but you know the odds. With uncertainty, you don't even know the odds. You know bad things might happen, you don't even know exactly what they are, or you didn't even know how likely it is to happen. So for those of a certain generation, that's going to remind you of Donald Rumsfeld's The Unknowns, that a lot of people made fun of him, but actually had some grounding. So what happens when there is uncertainty is that compounds with something, a psychological phenomenon called loss aversion that Kahneman and Tversky described, which is you are today in a situation which is not perfect, but it's okay. If you decide to migrate, it's this plunge in the unknown. You don't even know what might happen, but something might happen. And you would have brought that onto yourself, because you would have taken that risk. Migration is a risk that you take personally. And then what if you fail? You're going to lose face vis-a-vis others, and you're going to feel terrible. So this may be why people are very reluctant to migrate. For example, in the monkey experiment, why people are very reluctant to migrate, even after they are given information about what they might expect when they get there, because they might always think, well, this is what you told me, but then there are all these other things you didn't tell me yet. Before I move, I want to now spend some time talking about the US. So before that, is there any question?
Yeah, exactly. There is a specific question on the Denmark case that you discussed. Do you have a sense on what are the other impacts on the local population from a random influx of migrants beyond what was discussed in this paper? And then a general question on the effects of COVID. So what do you think are the results of COVID-19 on migration patterns? And the person was hinting also on work from home and these kind of things. And then the last question relates to what we discussed in the introductory lecture on how economists communicate with other people. And the person wants to know, how do you think can we communicate these insights to common people, especially since it might be very easy to peddle the simple xenophobic narrative over what you showed us today?
Right, so 3 great questions. So on the first one on Denmark, so I don't know about the Denmark cases itself, because in the Denmark cases, they really focused on these features, the complexity of the task, the occupation upgrading, and the wages. But across studies, you can look at, there are various studies that look at various aspects. For example, something I didn't discuss much in the lecture, but there is a literature on, that often people are asking, is that fine, they're not taking wages, but are they crowding out schools? Are they crowding out hospitals? Are they crowding out various welfare programs? And by and large, you also don't find overwhelming evidence that in most developed countries, the cities where migrants go are not equipped to face the migrants, partly because usually these are not very big influx of migrants. In developing countries, for the rich cities, there is an issue about insufficient infrastructure for everyone. So basically, this is a problem mostly for the migrants because they are on the margin of the system, and therefore they are even less access to the infrastructure such as they are. But it is a problem that also then becomes a problem for everyone because there is more people for less infrastructure. So a response in developing countries, there is a critical need of upgrading of infrastructure that are going to be beneficial both to would-be migrants as well as to the population that is already there. The COVID-19 crisis is going to have long ramifications on migration. We don't even know the extent of it yet. Partly because this was such a shock on existing migrants who were cut off, who had, I showed you the image from India where people had to try and scramble to go back, that people are were very terrified to go back again. And when the economy reopened after the first wave, the employers described finding it difficult to convince anybody to come back. And then in the middle, there was a second wave, which was not that easy for the migrants either. So between the two, one might expect that this stickiness that we talked about is going to be even more perceived. So let me spend the last few minutes on the US. Is it any different in the US? Remember Tocqueville talking about restless Americans and the fact that Americans are always moving, both in terms of their social classes and then in geographic. And in fact, what you're finding is since 1947, the migration rate has been about halved. Whichever way you look at it, interstate or inter-county migration, there has been a huge decline in migration. That's before COVID. So 2019 was already a historic low. Of course, 2020 was particularly low. So this is so the rate of inter-county migration was also divided by half. So you're seeing it in this graph. And another thing you're seeing in this graph is most of the drop in migration was precisely when there was started to be more competition from China on the job of many people in rural areas. So it's precisely when you would have thought that some places have shut down and people would have needed to move that they were less likely to do so. And another thing is that that's related to this to the occupational mobility that we discussed earlier. That is intergenerational mobility being higher for migrants. One source of that is that the natives are stuck in place, whereas the migrants, when they come, they can choose wherever they go. And so the migrants will tend to go to the places where there is a lot of mobility and a lot of things going on. So part of the reason, in fact, a large part of the reason why the intergenerational mobility is higher for migrants is that they go precisely in the type of places where people tend to be mobile. So on the right, you can see both for today and for the past, the social mobility for sons of natives. And on the left, you can see where you see the migrants. And you can see for the historical period that the migrants tended to go to the west where mobility was higher and to the east coast where mobility was higher, and not so much in the south and in the middle. In today's period, you find something similar but in reverse, which is basically the migrants are totally avoided the place in the Appalachian and the Rust Belt where mobility is very low and where the natives are stuck. So this idea that natives are stuck is one reason why there is less and less chance for the sons of fathers to succeed and to do better than their fathers. So why are they so stuck? Well, all of the reasons we discussed for the migrants in India also apply to Americans. And that's really a case where the same type of reasoning that we had work the best, work the same way. People want to stay where they are, etc. In addition, the price of housing is really a huge issue in the US. And this is, you have here photos of San Francisco, where the Mission District, which used to be a popular district, has become so expensive that no one except yuppies can live there and take jobs there. So they were trying to push them out with something called the Yuppie Eradication Project, but that didn't work out. As a result of this housing cost, even in places where people would make more money, their real wage would end up being lower. So in this context, how should we think about migration policy? Well, most migration policy is thought about in terms of legal limits to migration. When we think about migration policy, we're thinking about the caravans coming from Central America that we need to somehow find a human way to stop people. For liberals, it says we have to open the barriers, even though that's going to lead to a flood and that's going to be very costly because that's a human thing to do. For less liberal people, it's we have to close the borders or we will be overwhelmed. But instead, migration policy, paradoxically, should really be focusing on easing mobility, particularly with respect to internal migration. How do we facilitate economic integration? By facilitating housing, job matching services, and childcare. That, of course, is going to help integrate migrants, and migrants who are integrated are more likely to succeed and therefore more likely to also be accepted by the population. But we still need to keep the question that was raised before, which is, well, it leaves the potential clash of identity and the identity politics. It leaves the identity politics that, first of all, is going to make it difficult for natives to actually understand the potential benefits of migration. And second of all, is going to potentially lead to clashes and conflict. So we'll address this question of identity later in the course. So we are going to now flip. If you agree, we are going to both flip topic and lecturers. So Abhijit Banerjee is going to now start talking about trade for the rest of today.